Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Girls in Movement podcast. I know we've taken a short break over the summer, but boy, are we back with some cool guests this month. We are joined by a journalist, international speaker, and I suppose the go-to person on all things science and tech. Now, our guest is co-founder of a media platform which has open discussions around the disruption within the science industry. I think I'm keen to find out more about the world of science and the startups being developed around global change and her thoughts on the role of women within science and tech itself. So without further ado, I introduce Gemma Milne, co-founder of Science Disrupt. How are you, Gemma?
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me on the show. I'm doing great.
Good, good. I mean, for me, I think going into something like science and tech, I still feel like it's a real niche industry, and also having kind of a female role model for people to look up to is a really big thing as well. So we'll definitely discuss that later on in the show. But where did your interest in science evolve from, I suppose?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think a lot of it is probably, I mean, it's normally linked to your family, isn't it? And kind of how
Yeah.
you grew up. So my mum actually studied biology at university, but or zoology rather. She would kill me for getting that
Wow.
wrong. But she never did anything with it. So she just enjoyed it, did the degree, and now doesn't do anything at all to do with biology. And my dad's a stonemason, so he is a huge fan of maths, and he kind of uses it every day in his work, and has always been a big sort of he's a super curious person, and he was always sort of teaching me about numbers and whatnot. My granddad was the same. He's also a stonemason. So I kind of grew up sort of being encouraged to really play with numbers and enjoy numbers. And I don't know whether it was just being slightly more into maths. I always sort of shunned my mum's biology and was always like, no, I don't like biology. I only like maths. And so I kind of, that's what I ended up studying. I studied maths at university, and I was fortunate in the sense that at school I had good teachers in sort of physics and chemistry and maths, and I was really fortunate that I applied for a scheme when I was about 15 years old, where I got to go to NASA Space School in Houston, Texas. And that was, I kind of spent my summer sort of doing all these challenges online and having to, well, you did it online, but you had to post your submissions into the Scottish government, and you had the whole maths challenges, but then you also had to like design tools for the space station, all this sort of thing. And I was one of the sort of 26 taken to Houston, and that for me kind of massively opened my mind to being able to do something beyond a job in sort of my town in Scotland. And kind of, I guess from there it was, okay, I really like this stuff. There's more opportunity than I thought in this space. But then even then, I mean, I studied maths at university, and at the end I was kind of like, okay, well, I can be a banker, a maths teacher, or I can go be an academic. And I didn't really understand the broader implications until I was sort of already out in the workforce. So the interest has always been there, but it's kind of been a strange journey to get to where I currently am, and it was never sort of obvious how to kind of really have a career that you really like in the space of science and tech, just because it's so broad and it's not always advertised, I think, the best.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if one of the places in the world could help you make a decision that you want to stay in, like go in the field of science and tech, it would be NASA, I think.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And also just being surrounded by those other, 25 young Scottish people, we were, by the time we went, we were all 16 years old. We had all sort of chosen our the subjects we were going to be doing for our exams at school. Most of us had also kind of decided what we wanted to do at university, but it was also at the exact time that sort of Facebook came online. So we all added each other on Facebook. We were, most of us were sort of our first friends on Facebook. And it means that we've also been able to, follow each other and see what each other were doing and be inspired by one another. So a lot of it was actually not necessarily having role models that were older than me or kind of looking up to astronauts or something, even though I did do that. A lot of it was also just being connected with peers that really kind of were on the same wavelength. Because there's a few people at my school who were super into science. I've got some friends that are now, doing PhDs who I went to high school with. And I just went to sort of a standard high school in Scotland. I don't know what it was about my year. We just had a lot of nerds. But I think a lot of it was that being inspired by my peers and seeing everyone else's roots in that world that really kind of I don't know, always kept the fire alive, I suppose.
Yeah, amazing. And so, how did Science Disrupt evolve then? And was this the first sort of thing that you worked on after university?
No, so yeah, it's quite a funny story actually. So I studied maths at university and then I ended up going and working in investment banking, as a lot of mathematicians do. Decided that really wasn't for me, and then I decided to Google creative business jobs London because I was also, I do a lot of art and I play a lot of music, so I thought maybe actually I should, pie the maths and go do something completely different. So I ended up in the advertising industry, and I worked sort of as a account executive at a company called Ogilvy, and I did that for a year and a half and realized that also wasn't for me because being a sort of project manager isn't actually very creative, and I was really, really missing the sort of the numbers and the thinking about technologies and so on and so forth. So I basically ended up in an innovation team within the advertising company. So my job was basically scouting startups and going to conferences, meeting people, essentially being the sort of go-to innovation person within the company. So
Wow.
maybe one of the clients like American Express might say, oh, we want to understand why we should care about artificial intelligence, and I'd kind of get wheeled out to go do a workshop with them and explain what it is and introduce them to startups that might be people they could work with, all that jazz. So that was my job. And as part of that, because, I, I think probably a lot of it started because I was young, female, and in a sort of tech role in an advertising company, which is quite, interesting. I got asked to do a lot of public speaking. So I did a lot of traveling, going to conferences, presenting on future technologies, innovation, how companies could be adopting all these interesting things. But after I'd done a few talks and I kind of got a lot better at it, and people started asking me what I want to talk about, as opposed to going, hey, can you come talk about innovation in advertising? I was like, can I talk about maths? I really, really want to present why maths is really creative. I want the creative industries to think more about science. I'm kind of bored of hearing artists get up on stage and inspire the advertising industry. What about getting scientists? And what about trying to encourage people at this idea that technology is more creative when we think? So I got a really, I did a big talk at a big festival in advertising. It's called Cannes Lion, and I did a talk about why Euler's theorem is the most exciting theorem, and why you don't have to understand maths to be wowed by it, and why it can help you, enhance your creative juices. That was the kind of business theme. And that started a bit of a time of doing a lot of talks about like why science is amazing and why we should communicate science in better ways, and how the advertising industry could actually partner better with universities to spin science out faster and all these sorts of things. And it sort of culminated in me doing a talk at South by Southwest, and it was called How to Disrupt Science. And it was kind of, first of all, I was talking about the communication of science. I was saying, how many living Nobel Prize winners do you know? And kind of the answer was, well, none, sort of thing. But I also did a bit of talking about how could we make science as an industry more open. So how do we publish more openly? How do we change things like peer review? All these kind of quite nerdy inside baseball things in academia. And I had a lot, and at the time I was still working at Ogilvy. I was just doing this sort of because I thought it was interesting. And that talk, I had so many people come up to me and basically be like, oh, like, what are you doing? What's your job? Like, can I follow you? And I was like, I mean, I just work in advertising. I'm just interested in this. I'm really sorry. I don't really have anything else to give you. And they're like, oh, you should write a blog. You should do this. Like, I want to sort of, be part of what your movement. And I was like, this isn't a movement. I just thought it was interesting. And I did a talk. So anyway, I came home and I spoke to, my boyfriend Lawrence, who is a scientist, and he already had a podcast with some of his friends in his PhD program, and we decided, okay, let's actually do something with this, because there's clearly people want to talk about it. There's clearly a community around this idea of disrupting science. And we started a podcast, and then it turned into events in London. It's now a big online community, and it's sort of a bigger media organization. But we started that in April 2016. I was made redundant from Ogilvy. They shut the innovation team at the end of 2016. And so now my day job is that I'm like a freelance writer and presenter and whatnot. And my side project is Science Disrupt, although it takes up a lot more time than a usual side project.
So it'll be great to get to the a kind of place of where your side hustle becomes your day job. So yeah,
Well,
amazing.
maybe. I don't know if I agree with you actually, because I wrote this piece recently about how there's something really nice about side hustles staying as side hustles, you know? Like I love Science Disrupt, and I get a lot of pleasure from it, and I know that a lot of people get a lot of benefits from it, but I also really love my day job, and if I don't really want to give up what I'm doing for a living, to sort of try and turn a side hustle into a business that I might not like anymore, you know, because you're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices with a side hustle to commercialize it, to make it profitable, to make it something you can live off. And for me, I don't know, sometimes side hustles are kind of good as just that.
And it's interesting. I mean, like you say, you suddenly have to start thinking about cash flow and hiring people, and sometimes that passion just starts dissolving a little bit because it literally
Exactly.
starts turning into a business. And yeah, I mean, I mean, how I was talking about my kind of day job, working with startups every day, it's really interesting. And just to touch on the point before, I mean, we're talking today on a day where students everywhere are like opening their A-level results and they're like, oh my God, going to this university, or some people would be saying, I'm not going to this university. And it's interesting that you say you studied maths and you started working in advertising, and then this led you to think about Science Disrupt. And very similar to yourself, I did English and film at uni, but I never went into that after university. And I think it's always, you've got to follow your passion. And I know that sounds really cheesy, but you've got to. It's very easy to have a day job 9 till 5 in something that you did at university, but if you hate it, then what's the point of doing it, really?
I think also the whole thing about following your passion is is I'm sort of bought into it 50%, and then there's a 50% it's kind of like because for starters, I think most people have more than one passion, right? And not
Yes.
all passions can be turned into a job effectively. So for instance, one of my passions is painting. But I know that I would absolutely hate to be a painter. It would the pressure for me would be too much. I'm too slow at it. Like I would hate to be judged on it, all these sorts of things. Likewise, like another passion of mine is reading. Okay, could maybe be a book reviewer of books, to then write articles really quickly and frankly not get paid very much to write about them. So I think that the idea of following your passion is true in the sense of you do have to really consider what it is that makes you tick, and what is it that kind of gets you excited, and how do you get into these, when you're working away, you feel happy as opposed to it feeling like a slog. But at the same time, I think sometimes there's a little bit too much pressure put on people to be like, you must find your passion. You're not doing it right if you end up in a job that's you're only there because it's a 9 to 5. Like, you can still have a really fulfilling life if you have a 9 to 5 and then you have a great side project. So
Yes.
I think for me, it's my maths degree. Like I did that because I'm very fascinated by math. There was lots of parts of my degree that I absolutely hated, and it's one of the reasons why I ended up not going and being an academic. But now, I actually do use quite a lot of my degree because, yes, I'm a science writer and a tech writer, but I specialize in deep technologies and science spinouts, which a lot of science writers don't understand because they don't have the depth of understanding that someone who studied a quite logical degree does have. So for me, if you were to kind of work my way backwards from where I am now, it kind of all in inverted commas makes sense. But that's not ever how I sort of made my decisions. I kind of just was like, that looks interesting, that's going to make me happy. It might not be linked directly to one of my hobbies or one of my passions, but I think it looks like it could be a good move and could be kind of interesting. That was more how I made my decisions, as opposed to kind of going, I know that at the root my passion is maths, and I know that my passion is science and technology, so I must make moves that make sense, because otherwise I've never ended up in advertising, and I gained so much from being in that industry.
And just touching back to Science Disrupt as well. So with the podcasts that you do, I've listened to a few and they're really good. You
Thank
must have
you.
spoken to really amazing scientists and startups that are literally changing the world. Are there any that stand out?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. Yeah, loads. I mean, both from science jobs, and my day job is to write about science startups for like Forbes and the BBC and whatnot. So the opportunity to speak to these incredible people is the best thing about what I do. So I guess some of the science startups I'm really excited by are, Rigetti Computing is one of my kind of top ones. It's a quantum computing startup out of over in California, and they're both creating both software and hardware for quantum computing, which is insane, full stack quantum computing, totally mental. But they're definitely one to watch. The guy, Chad Rigetti, who started it, he was a quantum computing guy out of IBM before, so he's really knows his stuff, and how he's managed to raise financing to do quantum computing blows my mind. Another really fun startup that I wrote about yesterday or the day before on a totally different scale was this Nigerian startup called Coating Plus, and they've basically created this gelatinous, like transparent spray that you spray on things like grapes and apples and other kind of edible fruits and vegetables that don't peel, so you eat them directly. And what that does is it prolongs their life, so it stops them from rotting as quickly. But they also put nutrients into the spray because lack of nutrition is a huge issue in some areas of northern Nigeria. But basically they've created this coating out of an extract in shrimp shells, which is totally mental when you think about it. But I think they're super interesting because they're just the amount of money normally required to do that kind of sort of science enterprise, if you're in sort of the UK or the US, would be absolute, be millions. But they've managed to do it on this crazy shoestring budget. Super interesting. So yeah, those are two that I'm kind of currently I think are kind of fun. I just went to an agriculture conference, so that's kind of that's at the top of my mind. Another one I spoke to the other day, a health one called Nightingale. They're based in Finland, and they basically have created. I don't know if you read about Theranos and all the like crazy stuff around Elizabeth Holmes. There's a really good book out called Bad Blood if you want to know about it. But it's basically she had this committed fraud essentially around a science startup for blood testing. Anyway, this Finnish startup are actually doing what she said she was doing, but she wasn't. And it's essentially being able to run blood tests on just one sample of blood. So normally when you go to the doctors, they take a blood sample and they say, oh, we're going to go check your glucose levels with this sample. Or we're just going to check your cholesterol, or so on and so forth. And the system is kind of set up so that for every sample you take, they only test one thing. These guys have created a machine using magnetic resonance, which basically is able to conduct about 200 tests on one sample. So basically you get more information, more bang for your blood, shall we say. And what was really, I just came up with that, but anyway, they're really interesting because not only are they sort of disrupting the blood sampling and blood testing industry, and there's a lot of companies doing that actually, it's not just them, but they've also got this idea that they want to be able to take lots and lots of samples from lots of different people's blood and basically do essentially population economics on this. So you could say, we know that the population as a whole looks like there's going to be a high amount of diabetes in 10 years based on these blood tests. And so then you can advise the health secretary to invest more in preparing for a lot of diabetes in 10 years time, which is, totally changes the way we do health systems. So yeah, those are three at the front of my mind.
That's really exciting. That last one as well sounds very exciting. Definitely. I mean, moving on, I suppose, away from science as well. Talk to us about the role of women in technology. I mean, are you seeing a shift in science and tech and different women coming to the forefront of this, or do you think there could be more done?
Oh, it's quite a big question, I guess. I think things are definitely changing. I mean, I'm certainly seeing what I think is changing as well as the conversation. So one of the things I'm excited by is there's a lot of women who are being, for instance, asked to speak at conferences, but not being asked to talk about the fact that they're female. Because that's one thing that really kind of angers me a lot, is that you'll have, a conference or a TV program or whatever, and they'll say, look, we have half women and half men like represented. This is amazing. And you're like, wow, that is amazing. And then you watch it and all the men talk about, look at this company I've just started, or look at this piece of technology I've invented, or whatever. And the women talk about the fact that they're female and how hard it is, and diversity problems and all these jazz. And it's great that they're getting a platform, but it's like, these women also have started startups, or they've also invented something, or they're also scientists. Like, why are they not being asked to talk about their expertise? So that's something that I think is starting to shift. Like, people are understanding that maybe it's not okay to just ask women to talk about being female and ask them about what they actually do for a living or what they're interested in. So that's something I'm super interested by. But I think in terms of science and tech, I mean, it's very difficult because when you look at, particularly within science, like you look at the area of biology, it's actually skewed massively female, and it's the same as like in healthcare, skewed massively female. But the difference is that leadership tends to be men. So it's not that there's a lack of interest or that people aren't there. It's, I guess, the systems we have set up, whether it's to do with promotions, whether it's to do with maternity leave, then making it harder for women to continue to kind of move up the chain, whether it's the way women are treated when they're in the job themselves that puts them off carrying on. I mean, there's many, many different factors, but some areas of science actually have lots of women in it. And I think sometimes we kind of miss that conversation when we're saying, oh, you know, only whatever 5% of people taking computer science degrees are female. Well, go and look at biology research and you'll find it's massively skewed towards women. So for me, I'm excited by this slight shift in the conversation from just being like, this is why it's really hard to be a woman, even though that stuff is extremely important, and it's for women who are having a really hard time being able to kind of hear those stories is crucial for them to be able to feel that support. But at the same time, I think it's important to also have a bit more like, look at these incredible people, what they're doing, and let's not call them female, let's just call them scientists and or technologists or founders or whatever, or corporate CEOs or whatever. So I'm feeling positive about it. I really am. There's always more to be done. I also think there's a lot more to be done in sort of other areas that, you know, when you think about diversity as a whole, I mean, we've got the man-woman thing, but we also have, you know, huge issues in terms of socioeconomic inequalities, huge issues in terms of racial inequality. So for me, I'm kind of a bit more interested in how do we sort of get away from the woman man thing and actually talk a bit more, particularly socioeconomic is particularly of interest to me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the whole woman man thing was very historical as well. I feel like
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And science isn't just, science is kind of the world of like academia has also kind of got its own things going on versus the sort of world of business, right? Because, you know, with business, you've got a lot of things like pay disparities, you've got issues with promotions, you've got issues with paternity leaves, all these sorts of things. And academia have those as well to an extent, but they also have totally different incentive structures that aren't always based on pay, because scientists are not paid very well. So a lot of it is more around like opportunities to speak at conferences or papers published or being, you know, being referred to in a certain way. Like a lot of female people who have got PhDs who have the title doctor tend not to be referred to as doctor, even, you know, when they're sitting in right next to a man who also has a doctorate. You know, they'll say, you know, Dr. Smith and Miss Jones, even though they're exactly the same. So there's issues around that I think happen in science a lot, except from in biology.
And what about back to Science Disrupt? What's exciting that's coming up in 2018?
For Science Disrupt itself, I mean, we're starting to run a few more events this year. I think we're quite keen to kind of build on this idea of community. So we ran a lot of events, sort of 2016, 2017. Then we took a break for the last year. My co-founder's handing in his thesis at the moment, so he has been mental busy, and my freelance is kind of take off. So we took a bit of a break. So the idea is we're going to get back into this. How do we ensure that we're fostering a community of sort of science, tech, entrepreneurs and academics in London and other places too, because you know, you'll know from your day job and from obviously doing this work as well, there's so many meetups and discussions and so on and so forth for digital tech startups. I mean, there's one every night of the week in London, and the support, for some people they might not feel it, but I would argue that there's absolutely tons and tons and tons of support for digital startups. But when you're doing something like a biotech, or, you know, inventing a new material and creating a startup out of that, your challenges are extremely different than a digital tech startup. It's just non-comparable in so many different ways, and the support for that kind of work just isn't really there. There's not as many resources, there's not as many meetups, and a lot of scientists don't even consider spinning out and then creating companies because that support, they don't even know it's available, they don't know that that's a thing they can do, they think it's too hard, all that jazz. So for us, it's really about how can we create this sort of physical and online community of people and resources, and just generally making it a thing that's okay is creating a startup or getting science out the lab rather. and having, you know, academics talk to entrepreneurs and talk to VCs and bring those two together. And also, I mean, there's a lot of absolutely brilliant people in the digital tech scene that, you know, the world of biology is craving, like data scientists, for instance, software developers, Python developers in particular. Like there's people that biology massively needs, the world of academia massively needs. And you've got all these people sort of looking for opportunities, and just not, it's for us, I really like to try and pair that up. So that's kind of our we're sort of going back to that community building that we've taken a break from the past year.
Good stuff. It sounds really good. And I mean, for anyone that's listening, we'll add all the links to kind of the podcast, science website, anything interesting coming up as well. Final sort of question as well that I like to ask all my guests is, if you could give your younger self any advice, what would it be?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it would probably just be like, keep going, I think, because like I was bullied in school for quite a lot of my schooling, actually. And I was in a really fortunate position that I had parents who kind of, you know, they were very much like doing the whole "this will get better" and like, you know, this is not a sign of what your life is going to be like and all that jazz. But they never said to me, do you know what, it would be easier if you just fit in. And I've spoken to my mom about it a lot since, and she said, you know, sometimes I was really tempted to be like, why don't you just fit in? Because I was always really, you know, I was quite opinionated. I never know when gossip is happening. I'm quite oblivious to those sort of social sort of cues. So I was always kind of last to know stuff. I was like absolutely a total nerd. I played football, so I was a tomboy, all these sorts of things. And I kind of I had no intention of changing that so that I could be popular. And sometimes, you know, the thought crosses your mind when you're getting bullied, like, oh, maybe I should just like not be interested in these nerdy things anymore. Or maybe I should, you know, go to the party and drink alcohol because everyone else is doing it, even though I don't like the taste of wine yet because I'm only 15, you know. All these sorts of things. And luckily I had very encouraging parents who were just like, no, you do you, sort of thing. And the bullying will cease, and you won't get this in the real world. And you're going to be what you're building now in terms of your passions and your intelligence and your backbone, frankly, is going to be way more useful when you're older. And so for me, I think it probably would have just be a sort of word of encouragement there. It would be like, you're doing fine, just don't change stuff. Your older self is going to be so grateful for your younger self for not caving, so just keep going.
No, that's really well put. And thank you so much, Gemma, for being a really good guest on the Girls in Movement podcast. Anyone who's listening, again, we'll add all of Gemma's details. If you want to reach out for any advice, find out about Siemens Disrupt, then you can. Thank you, Gemma.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.
So